Hello everyone, my name is KDunlap and I am a sociology major. And for this video, I had the pleasure of doing a book review video for the book Barracoon by Zora Hurston. And basically, this book is about a slave who has survived the African slave trade, and he has lived to tell his story. And Zora Hurston is an amazing writer, and she was able to go and interview Mr. Cudjoe and learn about his past, learn about the events that occurred, and everything that took place. So in this particular assignment, we had to choose 4 chapters that we chose of our choosing from the book, and I chose chapters 1 through 4 simply because I believe that these chapters are basically the root of the rest of the events that occur later on in the book. I feel like without these 4 chapters, you will not have a deeper understanding on Mr. Cudjoe and the way he is, and you kind of see how some of his traumas or some of his memories, majority of his memories are deeply rooted in his childhood. And that is greatly discussed in chapters 1 through 4. So that is why I chose those chapters. And yes. All right, so a little bit of background information just for those who have never read the book or this is their first time hearing about the book. Basically, Zora Hurston goes down to Alabama. It's a little small town, little small city just outside Mobile, Alabama. And she goes to visit Mr. Cudjoe. And, well, not visit, so to say, interview. She goes down there and interviews him just to get a little bit more insight and an oral interview or oral lecture about the history of the slave trade that occurred. And basically, Mr. Cudjoe is amongst millions of Africans who survived this tragic event of slavery. He was one of the very few to survive and lives to tell his story. So based on this interview, she was able to kind of get his insight or his knowledge about what happened and kind of piece it together in a book and tell a story about it, to actually give those a chance to kind of experience from a person who went through this, kind of experienced the tragedy of everything that happened, the events, childhood until adulthood, and how basically a lot of people's heritage and culture was stripped away from them during this time. They're coming from Africa all the way over to the western part of the world, and those are two separate heritages, 2 separate cultures. So being stripped of one culture and taken to another is a very traumatic event. And basically he was here and alive and well to tell his story. Okay, so chapter 1. Basically, in this chapter, Zora arrives to Cudjoe's residence where he lives. And this chapter allows us to understand how separated Cudjoe really is or was from his African culture. And we kind of start to see that early on in the book, in the first chapter. And we see that his life by now, at this point, is deeply rooted in America. And he is very separated from what was once his heritage or culture, which was during his childhood time. And after analyzing this chapter, we are able to see that this kind of opens the door for Cudjoe to kind of start to allow himself to heal. This can kind of be the process or the door opening, the gateway to possibly healing. This interview will kind of allow him to talk about it and come to terms with it and try to heal from this process, because this is a very tragic process. So to kind of heal from it, sort of say. So that is chapter 1. All right, so moving on to chapter 2. I strongly feel like in this chapter we are able to see firsthand how much was taken from Cujo emotionally and mentally, and of course physically, but more so mentally and physically. In this chapter, we really get to see how living in America, during the beginning chapter, of course, chapter 2, how he was living in America and how he tries to preserve as much as his African heritage as he can. He really holds on to it, and we learn how deeply rooted his connection to his African heritage really is, sort of say, in this chapter, when he starts to recall his connection to his childhood and the things that occurred during that time. Okay, so chapter 3, further explaining the notion of holding on to his African heritage and holding on to his culture, we also start to kind of feel the energy of Cujo as we read this chapter. We kind of see that he kind of starts to be a little bit distant with Zora in his in the interview and doing the storytelling, sort of say. We also realize how big African culture is to people of African descent and how deeply rooted they are. And we kind of also see the connection in African cultures and other cultures today, how it is just as important or should be recognized just as any other culture, because it is a culture. It is a way of life for them. And just as how the Western world had religion back in those times, in Africa they didn't have religions. I remember one of these chapters, Cujo, I believe it was in chapter 1, Cujo was talking about the Christian God, or he was talking about God, and Zora asked him, well, what about the African, what about your African descent, or something like that, she asked him. And that's, at that point in time, he realized, wow, like, Africans had no religion, they had no Bible, they had no holy book, only lived by, sort of say, lifestyle. Their vision of a God, or their vision of religion, sort of say, was very different than the Western part of the world and what Cujo was brought to. Very different, very separated. We start to see the differences in that. However, when we're looking at culture, we can kind of start to see that African culture shouldn't be looked down upon, so to say. We kind of learn that, and we kind of see how he also is very deeply rooted in these American roots now. So he has been taken completely away, separated from Africa, and brought to America, and now he still tries to hold on to those African roots, to those African cultures, because that is where he comes from. That is what made him, and that will always live with him. So he tries to hold on to it as much as he can. Okay, so chapter 4 is what I really mean by these first 4 chapters really setting the tone for the rest of the events that occur later on in the book. Without these 4 chapters, I strongly feel that the rest of the book would be relevant. That is why I strongly chose these chapters. And chapter 4 specifically really starts to open up the road and to Cujo opening up to her. He really starts to open up in this chapter. She leaves her for about a week, and she comes back and with gifts, I believe watermelon, and it was watermelon and another gift that she gave to him, I believe a hymn. And she came basically like, look, I'm not here to make you really relive these events. This is not a regular conversation. This is sort of say an interview, for people to gain insight on what really happened during these times. You are a walking testimony for people, millions of other Africans who have died in the hands and in the events of slavery. He has lived to tell his story. So she kind of makes that clear that she's not really there for, to make him speak about it as a friend, but more so on an interview academic level. And she kind of sets the tone for that and makes him feel comfortable. And this is the chapter where he really starts to open up more. You know, he starts to talk more about his father in this chapter. He starts to really talk about his siblings. He starts to really try to open up about his childhood and the different events that happened in his childhood, such as how women got pregnant back in the day if they weren't fertile or infertile. And he starts to open up about all those different things. So we really, really, really start to kind of live through his story in chapter 4. So tying all this back to American history, or sort of say African American history, I say this book is a perfect tool, a perfect example to show younger generations that this is what happened in slavery. You know, our ancestors were stolen from their land, completely stripped of their culture, heritage, everything, and brought into the western part of the world to slave and work for other people. They need to know this is a true story that happened. They need to hear it firsthand from a survivor, you know? It's very important that we know these things about our history, and I feel like Zora did an amazing job writing this book, putting the interview together in a story-like sort of say way, and allowing the reader to experience these tragedies firsthand, allowing us to get a deeper look at what our ancestors went through. You know, it's one thing for someone to tell us in a history book what happened in slavery, but to actually get it from to actually get it from one of our ancestors and someone who survived, to hear it firsthand from his mouth, that's amazing. You know, I feel everyone should read this. Everyone of African descent, African American, white, it doesn't matter. Everyone needs to know this is what happened. You know, people were really stripped and really broken and taken. And, you know, people need to know that this really happened, you know? So my name is KDunlap, and I had the pleasure of doing this assignment for the African American experience. So thank you all for watching, and see you later.